What we're going to try to do today is look at the meta patterns that repeat across history, from the rise and fall of empires, the churn of democracies, the inevitable rise and fall of nation states, the invisible architectures that scaffold everything.
We are speeding up. We're speeding up very, very quickly now. Development is happening at a faster level than it ever has before. And how are we supposed to look at our societal changes, which are much slower than individual positive changes?
Right.
How are we supposed to see generational cycles within all of that, and economic cycles, geopolitical cycles, when we've got cycles of time that are speeding up from time to the timeless?
Right.
This is a huge leap, going from time to the timeless, and we get enough people there and it's going to have a huge change in our society.
Welcome, everybody. My name is Keith Martin Smith, and we're here again on the Integral Edge. And I'm very happy today to introduce someone who's really profoundly shaped our understanding of human development in the integral space. Terri O'Fallon is the co-founder of Stages International and the creator of the Stages model, which, in my opinion, is a remarkably precise and really very compassionate model of consciousness unfolding across our lifespans. Her work synthesizes decades of research in education, developmental theory, and integral meta-theory, and it really illuminates the subtle and transpersonal territories of growth with a lot of clarity, and I think with a lot of grace. Terri doesn't just study evolution, she really embodies it. And I had the honor of working with her for a few years at Stages International, and I'm very excited to have her here today. So welcome, Terri. And so today, Rob Smith just spoke recently. He gave a really beautiful talk on this sort of arc of history and the repetition of history as it concerns sort of business and development and consciousness and all these sorts of ideas. And so this idea of sort of recursions in history, it's been around for a while. And I think historically it's not been very sophisticated, but people have noticed that there do appear to be patterns, historically speaking, if one takes sort of a broad enough look at the history of the species. And so today what we're going to do, it's like, we really today we're standing on a pretty big fault lines of global uncertainty. We have an emergent China, Russia and Ukraine. We have Trump in the White House. We have all these meta-crises that are happening around the environment and late-stage capitalism and AI. And a lot of people are really wondering if we're about to move into a period of deep anarchy and collapse. And so, Terri, you and I spoke just a few weeks ago, and you really began to talk to me about this new sort of thing that you've seen and that you're developing about. You're seeing these recursive patterns of civilizations, economic, political, cultural, spiritual, that aren't random, but they're expressions of an evolving collective psyche, which would line up with your theory, which is obviously more around the evolution of the individual. But here we're obviously talking about the cyclical evolution of culture. And so what we're going to try to do today is look at the meta patterns that repeat across history, from the rise and fall of empires, the churn of democracies, the inevitable rise and fall of nation states, the invisible architectures that scaffold everything. And so I'm very curious to hear what you have to say, and I'm going to stop talking and let you jump in.
Well, this is a very big conversation, and I certainly am not going to be able to give much more than just an overview of everything in the time that we have, because each aspect of this can take a lifetime to work with, and many people have worked with each of these parts of this cyclical process that we're going through. So I have only one lifetime, so my process is to really look at how do these all interact, because we have lots and lots of views of cyclical time, but seldom do we actually look at how time itself has developed. So when a baby is born, there's no such thing as time.
Right.
They don't have any time. About the age of 7, they start getting an understanding of time. But between birth and 7, they get the first cyclical experience of time, which is night and day. I go to bed and I wake up. I go to bed, you do that, 365 days. You're going to really kind of get that there is a day and there is a night. Then, of course, when you're about 4 or 5 years old, you've been through the seasons 4 or 5 times. So you begin to realize, oh, it's winter now. Oh, spring is coming up. And then now spring is gone. And now I'm going to look forward to summer. And, oh, school is going to start. So I'm going to be in there in the fall. So we get those seasonal cycles. And so much of what has happened in the concrete tier, as we call it in the stages model, is their understanding of time by the time they finish the concrete tier. And that's really a cyclical, concrete kind of understanding where their future is really looking at past cycles. So the past is their future. They don't imagine much of a future that they've never seen before. And this is why the 2.5 conformist stage wants to conform so much, because they know what they've seen, they know what they've been through, they've got a history, they've got a generational history, and they know what's to come. But when they try and look with eyes in the back of their head, which is where their future, our future would be, it's scary.
Right.
So that's the kind of cyclical process that goes on. But at the early second-person perspective, which is still in the concrete tier, we have the first and the second-person perspectives in the concrete tier, we start understanding more granular time. And these days, we actually have watches and timepieces and things like that we can understand our time process with. And so that's a beginning of more of a general time throughout the day. It's time for breakfast, time for lunch, time for dinner, time to come home, time to go to school, all of those sorts of things. And that time is, 6 o'clock in the morning, I have to get up, I have to be done eating by 7. By 7:30, I have to be walking to school, and those kinds of things are what those watches are good for. So they're beginning to get a daily linear time kind of an understanding. Mm-hmm. Now, when we get to the subtle tier, we start seeing, our imagination, it begins to grow because our brain waves have actually developed. So this is a physical development that goes on, and I can talk about that a little later, but I'll just finish with the time aspect here. So we have then looking out in time of an imagined future that is usually more in a subtle kind of mode. And we really can only see about 4 or 5 years out, so it's not that far. But because we can see out into the future and it hasn't happened yet, we can learn to set goals. And so those goals help us become more linear. So linear time is really important.
Mm-hmm. And this is the sort of just pre-fully rational stage, right? The sort of expert phase. So you can see
the expert and the rational phase, oftentimes they say about 5 years out into the future.
Yeah.
A lot of times the way that I've recognized it is that they'll say 20 years from now I want to do thus and so, but it's the same as what they would imagine what they're doing 5 years from now. They will claim many years, but as far as actual being able to see that, well, this linear time expands more and more and more throughout the subtle tier. And of course, we get linear time as soon as we can imagine, as soon as we can use a watch or can look at linear time during the day. So linear time and cyclical time kind of are going on together in the second person perspective and in the early third person perspective. So we have linear time, and then we get to the fourth person perspective and we see that time is relative.
Right. Now, and this would be the sort of green and integral language, or sort of postmodern, pluralistic, all those sort of words. Right.
And we understand that again at the strategist stage.
So Terri, would that be, historically speaking, when Einstein equals mc squared, and it was shown that time was actually a variable, which really cooked a lot of people's noodles, right? But like, did that help to sort of open this up as far as people actually being forced to see that time was actually not set?
Yes. And some of this kind of thinking actually happened many, many years before, but it was at such a concrete level that it didn't come out as time and space, related to each other like Einstein was working with. When we get to the meta-aware tier, you have to, in order to get into these 4 later stages, you have to begin to see and experience certain states like boundlessness and timelessness. Now, we said a baby was timeless, but then we got time. Anytime, you get time, some sort of linear time starts happening at the second person perspective. Anytime after that, you can see you're likely to be able to pop into timelessness on the other side of time. You can't pop into that kind of timelessness until you have time.
Mm-hmm.
So each subsequent stage can get into these timeless, boundless states after that 2.0 developmental level, where they've already discovered boundaries and they've already discovered, relative boundaries and relative time. Then you can go on the other side of that. So subsequently, as each of these stages of development have developed, they can get into these timeless, boundless states with the relative being at the third person perspective, the fourth person perspective, the fifth person perspective. So we can have very early level people having very real experiences of the timeless, boundless field.
Right. And that would be sort of the classic spiritual experience, yes. Right? So I'm meditating and I'm still concrete 2.5 yes. or yes. even 2.0 amber. But I have an experience of timelessness and boundlessness, which then I experience it in the concrete world that I see.
Yes. And some people don't get those timeless, boundless states until they're fourth person, but they have to have them in order to complete the fifth person. For instance, the 5.0 and the 5.5 construct aware and transpersonal stages. Right. They can't get into those stages because their awareness is not large enough to see objects that are required for you to grow into at those 2 stages.
Right. And let me just, if I may, just restate that for people so they get it. So it's like, what your research shows pretty conclusively is that to move beyond teal and into turquoise in integral language, what's required is you really have to have had some of these sort of non-dual or timeless, boundless experiences, which help to sort of like unmoor the ego a little bit so that it can continue to so that the ego itself can continue to evolve into these timeless, spaceless, boundless places.
Well, you can go beyond your ego. You become quite aware of your ego at the transpersonal, the 5.5 level. and this isn't my research. I mean, other people have described this. I know Suzanne has, was talked about ego aware as well. So, most of my stuff have fingerprints from many wonderful people from all over the world, and I don't claim that I'm any genius about any of this stuff. The point I'm trying to make here is that we have timeless, we move into cyclical time, we move into a linear time, and then you can have, at some point in linear time, you can get an experience of the timelessness even as you work along the developmental levels up till you get to the meta-aware tier, and then you have to have them. And these timeless, boundless experiences then are timelessness on the other side of time. And there comes a point where all of the thinking and the rationalizations and the research and all of that sort of thing just doesn't work in the timelessness. So you transcend and include all of relativity, but then timelessness again at some point becomes an enduring capacity for us. So we start at the timelessness and we end with the timeless boundlessness. You can see that larger cycle there?
Right. Yes, I do.
But
So from basically 1.0 to 5.0, that's one cycle that begins and ends in timelessness. One's unconscious, obviously, one's very conscious.
Yes. And what I'm saying is that the timelessness before 2.0 is they don't have access to the relative. Then they have relative time, but the timelessness that they must have in the meta-aware tier requires that you have the relative too, because all of relative realities comes up inside of that timeless boundless field.
Right.
And of course, eventually into a non-duality and a saturation between the two. So this is kind of the cycle of time that I'm talking about.
Got it.
That is a cycle that we often don't think about when we're working with our our relative field. So if we look at that and look at the developmental stages that are at later meta-aware, and I'm sure that there are, we know that there are unified stages as well. What would society's aim be for? If you're looking at time that is beyond the relative, it seems like, if you have the capacity to see that larger cycle, you can see that there's much more to come, and that the consciousness or state or spiritual practice is really where we're all headed in some way. So that's one way to look at it.
Okay,
there's another way to look at time, and that is, let's look at the developmental stages and how they were accessed in time. For instance, these are some of the stage names that, and I'll name the stages model names along with it. For instance, the 1 point, when a baby is born, they are sort of in the archaic stage, and it took our human capacity 50,000 years BCE before they got to that stage. And they knew day and night by then and survival skills. Then in that first year or so, a baby moves into the archaic magic stage, which is a 1.0 stage in the stages model. Well, back when humans were developing, they say that that's between 50,000 BCE and 20,000 BCE. It took 30,000 years. It took 50,000 years to get to the archaic. It took 20,000 years to get to the 1.0. Then you go to the magic stage, which is the 1.5 egocentric stage in today's world. These earlier stages were likely adults before they got to the magic stage. Now we see children up to the age of about 4 or 5 in these stages. So you can see how much has changed since humans developed. So, You
make me think of the beginning of 2001 Space Odyssey with the sort of proto-humans,
yes.
The monolith and throwing the bones and everything, right?
Yeah. Here we go. We're from 10,000 BCE to 3,000 BCE. It took only 7,000 years to jump from magic to magic mythic. It took about 7,000 years to be in that, as opposed to the 20,000 years that it took for the previous stage. Then we go to the mythic, which is the conformist stage. Well, that took another 2,500 years. You see what's happening here?
Right. So cycles it's compressing. It's probably an exponential rise. Would that be probably right?
The next one only took 2,500 years. That's the mythic. Then the mythic rational 3.0 took, and that was during the axial age, took 2,000 years.
Right.
So the rational then which is the Enlightenment phase and scientific revolution and logic and that sort of a stage. That took 300 years to get to and go through. Then we have the rational pluralistic, which is green. And it takes us from modernity to postmodernity, civil rights, democracy, postmodernism, that sort of thing. It took only 150 years for that to develop, from about 1800 thereabouts to about 1960. Then we get to the next one, which is really what we call it's the 4.5 strategist. Sometimes people call that integral. Integral can go much later than that, but it only took 50 years. So now we've gone all the way to what we mostly recognize today, from 500,000 years to get to the next stage, 50 years to get to the next stage. And the pluralistic integral was where culture wars and systems, complex adaptive systems have occurred. And inclusion is really important. Being able to zoom back out and see the pain points in these large complex adaptive systems and make changes in them and recognize those are going to ripple out all over through the world. So then at the 5.0 stage, which is the next one, that actually came up from 2000 to present. And we know that Suzanne did her work with this construct-aware stage. We call it 5.0. And Ken talked about it. It's a meta-theory awareness, 2000 until today. So it's been another about 25 years, but today it is recognized much sooner than now. And so that took about 25 years from the 50 years from the strategist stage. And then we've gone now into 5.5. It is emerging right now. And then we have the higher mind. It is emerging right now. Then we have the next stage is the illuminating. It's emerging right now. So in the past 50 years or so, we have the emergence of 5 developmental stages. So all of these, we have people in all of these stages, some far more in some of these stages than the later stages, but there are people walking this earth that really have some pretty advanced capacities to see from, which are requiring some sort of timeless, boundless, or experience. And, we also know that Aurobindo and Wilbur and some of these others have talked about these are ones that are in view, which is like the 7.0 intuitive stage, the overmind stage, the supermind stage. These are all there. So what I'm saying by just going through this time factor here is that when we get to the place where a bunch of stages are actually so close together that they're emerging together rather than taking 50,000 years, how are you going to see a true cycle when your experience of or your research of the cycles are 5,000 years?
Right.
So this greatly affects things. We are speeding up. We're speeding up very, very quickly now. Development is happening at a faster level than it ever has before. And how are we supposed to look at our societal changes, which are much slower than individual possible changes?
Right.
How are we supposed to see generational cycles within all of that, and economic cycles, geopolitical cycles, when we've got cycles of time that are speeding up from the time to the timeless?
Right.
This is a huge leap going from time to the timeless. And we get enough people there, and it's going to have a huge change in our society. So the cycles that I see that are in recursion are generational cycles right now. We've got some good information on generational cycles. And the thing is that you can look at generational cycles in a particular kind of way, and that is, I can remember my grandfather and my grandmother, and they have told me all the stories that happened during their age, and so I kind of know that in a personal way. I know what my parents taught me, and the cycles that I grew up in. Now I know what my cycle is, but by the time my children are born, they don't have any reference point to my grandparents' world. That
Right.
is nothing but a story. There's not an embodied cell in my bones anywhere that I
Right.
really feel that. Each cycle is farther and farther away, removed from the last big blow up. And so about every fourth generation, according to some of these generational cycles, something's going to blow up. So we can see that. But when we, they'll say, oh, the last time we had a big cycle was during the World Wars, and that cycle was a very large cycle, and it took about 100 years now to get to this now new blow up. And they've traced those blow-ups back through the Civil War, back through the European history, and about every 100 years for many, many years, there's been this huge cycle where this kind of blow-up happens. What they don't really trace so much, though, is the developmental changes that people have in each cycle. We know there's a blow-up, but what kind of a blow-up is it going to be?
Right.
Developmentally. And so, we're at an age right now where we've got all these emerging developmental stages pretty much kind of coming up together, because they're just emerging so quickly. Even though it takes time for each one, it's nothing like it was when we got the first 1.5 50,000 year chance to gradually change. Change is going to be a very, very quick thing, I sense, because of this time cycle and what it's moving us from and moving us to. So we have economic cycles that people have talked about as well, which look at the different economies that are happening. And
it's certainly technological, right? Because that's another exponential increase. Moore's law and all that sort of stuff. But this sort of
yes,
exponentially increasing rate of technology impacting individuals and cultures.
Yes, and you have to really look at the technology and see. We look at our LLM models, and it's really easy to become quite mesmerized with them. I don't have a big opinion about them. It's just that I really question whether they're ever going to be able to experience timeless boundlessness.
Yes. Well, there's the question of
there's. You can be derailed a lot by that.
Right.
And if we're looking at what is the purpose of humanity, which is, something I think we all need to consider. What is our purpose from a larger sense? We will want to start getting into the timelessness on the other side of time, timeless boundlessness on the other side of time, and then look at what are the technological processes that are going to help us get there, and how can we be derailed by those at the same time? Right. So that's a really good question.
Right. Well, can you say more about so you're saying generational cycles. Can you get into that just a little bit more? Sort of what that means?
Well, the cycle that got us the Civil War is not the kind of cycle we're in now, for instance.
Okay.
Because that was the kind of cycle where, there's at one point in history, people develop a certain aspect of capacity where they, it's probably a more of a 3.0 stage where they do not have they don't allow slavery anymore, and yet we do find certain phases of it, because we have every developmental level that was ever there is still here on this earth. So we still see slavery in some ways, disguised it as something else often, but the cycle that we're going through right now is really looking at is our societal system of capitalism that we've been working with, which is more or less a third-person perspective economic cycle, is that a lot of times it's just, for a lot of people, it's an assumption that is the only cycle. There isn't anything after that. And then, of course, there are other people that are looking at, well, the principles that we have that are beyond that are for health, well-being, and service more than it is for making money and having power and getting what we want and all of those kinds of things. So what I'm saying is that if we go back and look at each of these generational cycles, we'll see that they occur at a particular societal developmental level that will help us move into a new system. The problem is that, it took, our earliest social experiences of tribalness and that, at least 20,000 years to do that. But they had many, many generations. So they had lots and lots of generational cycles to go through before they ever reached the next generational societal process.
Right. Change came slowly and somewhat predictably.
Yes. And we aren't seeing that now because we've got people who, I think there's probably more achiever people in this world than there are anything later than that. And yet we have significant numbers of people that really understand the social construction of reality, that the pluralist and autonomous or strategist teal stage. And all of these are operating at once. And even as they're operating, we've got later level people who are emerging into, some of these later cycles where they can see larger and larger political, geopolitical. Right now we have a global system. We didn't have a system that, if one country crashes, the whole world suffers anymore.
Right.
So we have, much different kind of process. And so what I'm saying is that when you're just looking at a generational cycle and saying there's a blow up, there probably would be a blow up, but it may be a blow up in the same developmental level when it takes 20,000 years or 2,500 years or 100 years or, probably 300 or 400 years. You're going to have maybe several blow ups before you manage to get to the next societal system that comes up.
Right. And the blow-ups can be anything from a world war or a civil war to hopefully something less disruptive. Do you see these changes coming in more peaceful, or maybe the cultural revolution of the 60s, that wasn't really a war. But it was painful for those that went through it in a lot of ways. But it was really, would you see that as a potential as we move out of the sort of late stage third person capitalism into a fourth person capitalism plus, these other things, well-being, societal concerns, actual globalist views, seeing that money and economies are actually constructs, that they're not in many ways kind of quote unquote real.
They're social constructs.
Yeah, money. What is a $20 bill? It's entirely a construct. It's a piece of cotton with some ink on it, right?
Yeah. How about the time zones? Those are constructs.
Time zones, right? Yeah. Yes. Obviously, from a certain perspective, the entire human realm is nothing but a construct, somewhat obviously, but
when you get to that later on, and having that as an individual construct, you see it from your own self and not being necessarily socially constructed that way. But let's just take a moment to look at the 3.5, and there's 3 or 4 different levels of capitalism that have come about.
Right. Sure.
That have come up in between that, but it's still capitalism, and it still has its overarching principles. I think that our world is still largely capitalistic, and I don't think that we've got too many, if any, that are fully have any country that, or many anyway, that have fully embodied the pluralist level. But we've certainly had people have experiments, but it's not mature yet.
Right. Well, let me ask you something that's fascinating to me, Terry, and you're probably the perfect person to help me understand this. But so the American Revolution and the French Revolutions, right? They were sort of remarkable in how they played out, trying to overthrow monarchy, install democracy, et cetera.
Yes.
But the American system was based in this kind of more amber idea of a constitution, and in early capitalism, which was the quote unquote enlightened self-interest, which they figured would harness lesser developmental levels for the greater good. And the French, because they didn't have a constitution, they didn't have that sort of amber bedrock. When they threw out the amber, all that was left was red chaos, or the reign of terror, right? So they went from a monarchy to just complete and total chaos. And the Americans went from a monarchy to a reasonably stable early democracy. So maybe you could help us understand that a little bit through this lens that you're using.
Well, I think part of it is the way that we look at our own imaginary or unconscious or simplistic belief systems that are at play during these revolutions. And let me just take one, for instance. Autocracies are bad and democracies are good, right?
That's what they tell us.
Well, when you really look at it, you can have a narcissistic democracy and you can have a benevolent autocracy.
Absolutely, sure.
And so some have both qualities. You can have an autocratic structure and democratic policies. That's probably going to come from a more benevolent dictator. And then you can have democratic structures and autocratic policies.
Yes.
So you see, you start blending these, and then we don't look at the levels of these autocracies and democracies and autocracies and anarchies.
Right.
So, we have them in the family.
Right. Well, I mean, you look at the early democracy before the founding of the United States, and the Quakers were very famously, very democratic, kind of early modernist viewpoints.
Yes.
And they were very famously democratically voted out of their own state, right? So the tyranny of the majority, which is part of what the founders here saw as a real danger of democracy. Right?
Yes. But, here again are some more cycles. We have family cycles of autocracy and democracy. If you happen to grow up in a 2.5 family, you have a very autocratic kind of upbringing because things are the way they are and you're going to do what I say and I'm the dad in the house and that's how it is, And then when you grow up in let's say a 4.0 pluralist society, it's everybody's equal. Yeah. Honey, we're going to buy a new house and we want your opinion. Right. What kind of a house would you like, honey?
A big one.
Yeah. I mean, it's that kind of we're all equal sort of thing. So many children that grow up in a fully democratic pluralist family end up having, they don't learn to follow the rules.
Yeah.
And because they don't learn to follow the rules, they don't have very many friends because friends don't like people who get their way all the time.
Right.
And so they turn into little narcissists and they start being bullies and they're the loneliest kids in the world. And some of our autocratic leaders may have grown up that way. I don't know. But anyway, if they do grow up and they finally get over all of that, the main thing they want to do is make sure that their children never have to go through that again. So they become far more autocratic.
Right. Okay. So, and this is more to the generational cycle.
That's
So,
right.
so if my parents were strict, then I might be a really liberal parent, and then my kids might say, "Well, boy, that really screwed me up in being so liberal, so I'm going to be strict with my kids." And so you get
Yes.
into a sort
And
of
then of course, the cycle repeats itself. So it's in every other or every third generation or so,
uh-huh.
based on the processes. Then there's shadow to consider. I mean, if
Mm.
you're a true narcissistic person, that is a deep, deep shadow, and if you don't really work with it, it's going to stay with you right up into your leadership, no matter what developmental level you're at.
Interesting.
So
Well, let me pause you there. So narcissism then can really manifest, or let's just maybe say it's probably sort of a spectrum, right, rather than a binary, but that can really manifest all through the developmental stages. How fascinating! I
if
wasn't.
it's
So,
a
so you can
shadow,
be 5.0 and be still have real narcissistic tendencies.
we've seen a few
Mm.
people that really seem to have that as a problem.
Interesting.
Yeah,
Interesting. Okay, that's fascinating.
yeah. They
Because
don't
I
get
think
very far, though. I can say I've never seen them get very far, but I've seen them have to really grapple with some of that kind of
interesting.
shadow, and it's hard when you wait that long.
Because people, I think, what in a more back of napkin developmental understanding would put narcissism sort of preamber, sort of a red impulse, but that's probably inaccurate unless they have a full
Well,
on personality
narcissism,
disorder.
yeah, narcissism is a natural thing at the 1.5
Right.
egocentric
Of course.
level.
Right.
Your child doesn't know what the rules are, and he
Right. Right. They're a
doesn't.
little narcissist. Right.
Well,
Mine. Everything
they
is mine.
are, and they're delightful little narcissists. It's just that if you don't train that narcissism out,
Right.
you're going to have somebody that is miserable all their life, and
Mm-hmm.
a lot of people around them will be miserable because
Mm-hmm.
they don't have, you get, especially when they turn into leaders, and we do have
Right.
many leaders, and a lot of these narcissistic leaders are not benevolent.
Right.
We
Right.
have Hitler. We have, and if you look up on the internet and you just look for all of the narcissistic leaders, they'll tell you some of the ones that are right here today as in agreement by a lot of people.
Sure.
But they will also tell you the ones that were benevolent. Tito. I can remember hearing it was terrible that Tito was a dictator, that they thought it was a terrible thing, and yet his people, Yugoslavians, especially Kosovo, they loved him because
Right.
he gave everybody had a job and everybody got educated through early college and all of these things, and he made sure that happened for them.
Right.
So
Right. And I would never say that FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was a narcissist at all, but he certainly, he was elected 4 times, and he really straddled the country. I mean, people really, really, really hated him or really loved him, but he was, because he was a fixture at the top for so long, and he was trying to, get the court, sort of stuff the court in his way, and he was
yeah,
certainly up to some shady things and some great things, right? But like
yeah, that's
certainly
right.
a big ego, that's for sure.
Well, Roosevelt was I mean, he is one of the people that they remark about a lot. Is he could have been a dictator if he'd lived another 20 years, because we
Right.
didn't have limits on people being a president until
After he died, yeah.
began to realize this guy could have, but he also had internment camps, right?
Right, that's right. Yeah.
So you can have people that are really do so much good. We're just probably not going to find a perfect thing, but some things are a little better than others.
Yeah. Well, so as we look at these, so like as I'm listening to this and I'm thinking, okay, I'm reasonably self-aware and really have a decent sense of what's going on in the world, and there is a sense of personally, there's a sense of sort of anxiety at looking at the rising of all these things, with all these
Yes.
meta-crises we talked about, and the rise of AI, which is very worrisome to me personally, and so many other things, right? And it's like, so from one view, I say to myself, well, everybody thinks they're in the worst possible time. Like you go back 100 generations, everyone's going to say, oh, this is the worst. We're at the worst time we've ever been in. It seems like it's part of a human condition on one level. And then on the other level, it does seem actually objectively a little worrying, all the things that are at play in this world. So maybe you could just speak to that a little bit with these recursions and
Yeah. Well, some of the earlier
how I might
recursions,
be able to relax a little bit, you know?
some of the earlier recursions are the world wars, for instance, and Hitler. Millions of people were killed
Yeah.
in some of these previous ones. So far, we don't have a war where millions of people are killed. Although we've got wars all over the world now, but the hope is that there will be enough sense here that we'll be able to prevent that. We don't know it, but we certainly don't want another world war. We have a narcissistic, autocratic person that is working within a democratic structure right now. It appears that he would like to kind of get rid of that structure so that he can have more of what he wants.
And this is Trump. Trump. I mean, I think even Trump's people that are glad he's in power would admit that he has narcissistic tendencies. I don't think that's controversial. Yeah.
And so far, the structures, we're just checking to see if the structures are going to hold.
Right. And maybe that's not a bad thing to test the system, right? I mean, the system should be able to hopefully withstand someone that's trying to tear it down. Otherwise, it's not very anti-fragile.
But most people look at Democrat or Republican, and really, that might not be the best view that we can be taking developmentally. Maybe what we can do or should do or would be useful to look at is the kind of conservatism of the achiever level. There's some more liberal people in that viewpoint too, and you don't want to categorize everybody this way. And then there's, because they have their problems, and so does the pluralists. We just talked about some of those. But
I've talked about them quite a bit, yeah.
But what maybe one of the best next structures we could look at in leadership is how can you connect those two, because they each have benefits. And
So in other words, how can you obviously transcend this sort of liberal conservative divide and take the best of both rather than the best of one or the other?
Yes, that might be a good thing for us to look at. How can you actually look at a leader that is a principled leader? That means they've got ethics. They've lived long enough and served long enough that they have an ethical structure that supports all the levels of development and doesn't want to, but also is seeing that they hold people to a capacity where each one of those developmental levels is not going to do any harm. So there still would be a kind of rule of law, and then. They also have a capacity to see farther out into the future. So when it comes to the economics, they don't look at the economics of, okay, what's going to help they don't just look at what's going to keep eggs from getting too expensive, And that might be important, but that's, a lot of people who are suffering out there, they need their safety needs recognized.
Sure.
And so they have to have that, and that's just a symbol of the safety needs that they need to have recognized. So, what people at the teal level would be more apt to do is look years into the future and see how can we create safety structures for everybody without going in debt.
Right. And so you're talking about, this would be the move really, because orange and green, they have metacognition, but at teal, you have a meta-systemic point of view, right? Where you can really, because I can see this, I mean, this is really what Rob Smith is, where he's speaking from, is this meta-systemic point of view.
And they're global.
That can see the economic systems and the policies and all these things and take that long, what's a multi-generational view, not what's a 20-year view, right?
Yes, because 4.5, the teal level in the way that we describe it, knows that they are creating something that they may never live long enough to see.
Right.
It goes beyond your own generation. So they are multi-generational. They can actually see 50 years in their past and 50 years in their future. They can see 4 generations and have a pretty good experience of actually generating that. Now, not everybody wants to be a leader.
Sure.
Leadership is a tough deal.
That's
But,
right.
you get enough people being leaders at this level. And we've got some people that have had some decent capacities in that teal level. Maybe we don't have enough experience really in the world with people leading from this level, but there are some leaders that have, and I think that we can really look at some of the qualities that are beginning to develop in the people that are being elected today. I've always talked about conservatism on the other side of liberalism, where you use money from a long point of view and look at how can you make your economic policies. True, there's cycles, but if we have enough leaders that can look beyond the cycles that we think that have happened in the last 100, 200 years, because we're evolving fast now.
Right. Well, and the thing, I'm noticing, this is completely anecdotal, but I am noticing in the conversations that I'm having with people, more and more of it seems like more and more of a capacity to hold this sort of meta-systemic point of view that people are. I'm just seeing that there seems like there's an increasing quiet capacity to see beyond the noise, and maybe all of the noise that we're experiencing in some ways is helping push the quiet people into something that's beyond left or right. That's kind of, again, it's my anecdotal experience. I travel with an odd group of people, so it might not be very reflective of reality, but it's hopeful to me.
That's what we're seeing in all of the gatherings around the United States now. They're not just right or left. They're not just Republican or Democrat. They are looking at the things that they hold in common that they want for themselves and for this country. And a lot of it does have to do with we need a certain amount of safety and structure to feel safe so that we can go and have some fun and
Right.
enjoy our lives, as well as plan for our children and make sure that they get a good education.
Right.
As we're watching our education department be dismantled, and
You spent a lot of your career in the education world,
for
right?
somebody that really values education and looking at what kind of education do we want people to have. Is it simply an education that will get them into a career? We've had a lot of that.
Yeah, that's how I was raised, certainly.
But what happens when you get into a later knowledge based and service-based developmental social stage? You're going to want to have people understand and view the arts as something that's important and have that in their education. You're going to want to have them biologically healthy.
Right.
So you're going to want to look at the whole person when you get to this teal level and make sure that everybody has an opportunity for that. You're going to look at the poorest children and the poorest people on the earth as ones that are still going to have children. And you're going to want to put everything you can think of to help those children grow up to be healthy and well-balanced. You just almost can't tolerate it. And right now, we don't have to look at our children that way. Every parent does the best that they can with what they have, but they don't really actually have a sense of the cycling parental stages. Because parents have stages too, and they can match their children's stages or they can mismatch them. Usually, parents are in a stage long enough that they will have one stage they like, and they aren't used to shifting from one parenting stage to another. You need to have an absolutely loving and permissive parenting style for a new baby.
Right.
For 1.5, you need to have a kind of autocratic state.
Right. You gotta
Or
socialize that little narcissist, right?
for 2.0, you need to have a more of a pluralistic, because social and having a friend is more important than anything while you maintain, the rules of setting. And then you have to have almost a faith while with guidance for your teenagers, knowing what's going on with them, but being a little bit more of an anarchy as far as that's concerned, by letting them really step into themselves and even further. So, you have to, if you have an autocratic problem, it's not a problem, but an autocratic parenting style all the way through, you're going to you're going to have 3 developmental levels of your children not liking you very much. And they're the ones that are going to say, I don't want to be like my parent, and so they'll be just the opposite of you. And then they'll fall into the exact opposite process there. So, so you see how these cycles are everywhere. If you look at autocracy and democracy, we can see it in capitalism. We can see it everywhere. And some of these cyclical flips are probably there to help mature capitalism till it gets to the next stage, or mature, like if you have 300 years to get from one social stage to the next social stage, you probably have 2 or 3 cycles back and forth, and sometimes they may flip to an autocracy, and you may end up with a narcissistic autocracy. But you can have these flips and not really shift to a whole new developmental process.
Right.
As today, we don't really have that much time because we've got all these stages emerging together.
Right.
So this is something that we aren't thinking about, and I don't know if there's a real, I don't know if there's anything that we can do about it or not, but, it might be something that will help us look at what is the best next place we can be. I would say that a teal leadership would be especially good because it would have aspects that would satisfy both the 3.5 achiever and the 4.0 pluralist.
Yeah.
Because it's based on an ethical base. It reveres all developmental levels. It doesn't allow any harm to be done along the way, and so sees that laws are enacted that will be protective. It can see generations out so that it has a long view, and it doesn't let us get economically in debt so that we are going to fall whether we've got a good democracy or a bad one.
We are certainly in debt. What, 30 trillion? I can't even, it's some incomprehensible number. But so, I mean, the call then, is for really teal leaders, and I guess in business, in our homes, and certainly with our politicians. And maybe one of the things we're really struggling with in 2025 is just the way that social media has come onto the scene. It really maximizes the lower developmental levels that are making the most noise, which might really create a reality distortion field for a lot of us, right? Things look worse than they are. If I look at my Facebook feed, I mean, in all seriousness, if I look at my Facebook feed, you would think we're entering the Fourth Reich. I mean, people are histrionic, right? But is that actually what's happening? And so we end up with this warped view of the world that can generate hopelessness and probably, to your brother Kim's point of view, facilitate a shadow crash where then suddenly, if I'm scared, I'm going to be coming from a 2.5 or 2.0 or maybe even lower, right? And 1.5, and go start throwing firebombs at Teslas and goodness knows what else.
Yeah. What we need to do, well, I don't know. I mean, I'm certainly not an expert on what we need to do, I guess, but I think it's time that we really take a good look at our technology before we invent it. And this is a 5.5 level They understand reification. They can come up with this great understanding all the time of what I can create in the relative world. And then they stop and ask the question, I can create it, but should I?
Right.
What
right.
kind of harm might it do? I don't think people are asking this.
No.
Then they create. Then if they can see that it can also do good, they shape it in a way that will prevent the harm that they're pretty sure it will do. Like our social media today, the way that it is, it does massive harm to massive people, and
Right.
even as it connects people around the world in beautiful ways. Now, people in the media could make sure that doesn't happen.
Or they own the companies, yeah, right?
And so their companies have to be evolutionary. In other words, what they need to do is look just 2 or 3 years down the road, see if it's going to have any harm, but all the time, all the way through time, in the future of their organization, they need to look, what kind of harm are we doing or might we do? We have to constantly look at where is the harm, where is the pain point, where are we hurting people?
Right.
What is it? What is our good doing bad?
Right. And when it's, I remember when I say like I'm 1,000 years old, but I mean most of us remember when social media came about in the early to mid 2000s, before it had been really tied into the sort of gross money making game, when it was actually really was more connected, and they weren't ginning up the algorithm to sort of pump up outrage and maximize views and it was before they figured out how to get advertising dollars in there and created the like button and all that stuff and
manipulating our minds, and of course the manipulation of our minds is going to happen anyway because it is. But if you know that you're socially constructing things, you have an obligation, you have an ethical obligation to not do anything that is going to social construct some process that is going to hurt somebody.
Right. And this is where we get into the bind of capitalism, right? If I run Meta and I have I have this meta-systemic point of view, but I also have a board and I also have shareholders, and so things can get bent to serve maximizing profit, which is almost never going to be in the best interests of
That's right.
of the whole.
That's right. And that's why we're probably going to need to move to something a little different than the kind of capitalism we've had. It needs to mature farther, and maybe this is the time where we will make the great leap from capitalism to something that is more conducive to seeing all developmental levels and the safety needs and the safety nets of a long future. And that would be the 4.5 level. I think that, I mean, we'll just have to wait and see what the U.S. folks can tolerate, and whether or not, our democracy is going to take a turn towards an autocratic democracy, probably a narcissistic autocratic democracy. Conformist people would rather have a narcissistic democracy than they want to be told what to do because they can't see the future.
Right, because they see the future as an extension of the past, which really scares them.
So they would rather have somebody, whether they were a narcissistic kind of view or a benevolent kind of view, they would rather have anybody tell them what to do than to have nobody tell them what to do, because they get frightened. Right. And we still have a fair number of those, but I think most of them are, they're teenagers and early 20s at that viewpoint. And 3.0 can have some of those feelings too, because they've got one foot in the conformist level,
Right. Well, so Terri, just as sort of as a big statement here, you obviously you've children, you've grandchildren, as you look at the next 50 years, do you feel hopeful?
I guess I do have great faith. We have had many terrible tragedies in the human throng through many, many years, and I mean, we could blow the whole world up, and there might be a few survivors that would have to start all over again.
Which has happened before. If you take long enough back, right? I think
Yes,
80,000 years ago,
yes,
an island blew up somewhere off of Africa, and I think it wiped out almost all the Homo sapiens.
yes. And also, when I think we got hit by something from outer space too that was kind of blew the world up too, during the dinosaur regions and all of that. So, I mean, that could be what happens. But given that kind of a process, my sense is that, if they manage to not use, nuclear bombs and that sort of thing, I think we're going to make it through this phase. I think that there is absolute hope. I think that this is going to be a very big change for everybody, and we'll have to see whether sooner or later they want to. I mean, there's some problems whether we take care of it right away or we wait too long. We don't want to just kind of jump back into the democracy that we had. We'd like to see some progress here. And we also, and our democracy that we had is a wonderful democracy, but we can grow up. We can grow up and be better. And I think that teal level would be a better one for everybody, not just for, some people and not for others.
Right.
But then, we could wait too long and destroy what we have, and that destruction is going to have adverse effects all over the world. It's going to destroy more than just what we have in the United States because of the power that the U.S. has had for so long. I'm not a very political animal. I don't know all of the insides and outsides of all of that, but looking from a larger back a ways, my sense is that it's anytime you go through a leap in a developmental leap socially, you're going to find, some scary things that feel scary, and then people will step back into a new world and they'll feel excited about it again. And let's hope that's where we're going. And from the largest view that I've been able to take, and I don't know if it's the largest view, but it's from the view of all of the history of the timeless to the timeless beyond time. I think humanity has a purpose, a really, really important purpose. And I think we get derailed a lot of times by our technology, and we haven't learned yet to ask the big questions about what harm can we do or are we doing. A lot of people who ask those questions aren't technologists. That isn't the kind of field they're interested in.
Sure, it's a big part of Vajrayana Buddhism, that's for sure. Right, which is the
so my sense is that there's not just a social, a fiscal, a geopolitical, a political, developmental kind of process that we're looking at here on the relative side. There's also an ethical, which is another word for me of, if you go deep enough into those ethics, you become conscious in a way you never were before. And some people don't like the word spiritual. I don't think we have to put any particular name on that, but we go way, way, way beyond anything that could cause harm of any kind, So that's kind of the space I'm standing in right now, and I don't know if it's helpful for anybody, but as I look at all of these cycles and recursions and this sort of thing that's going on in the world, I see that there's recursions and cycles inside of cycles, and we can have recursions, with as small as day and night, and even smaller than that. Right. Or we can see the recursions and the cycles coming up inside of much larger cycles, and it brings the question up for me. These cycles have always been there. We just have to see them.
Right. They might be deep structures in the cosmos itself.
Yes.
right? Or maybe, right? And that's if we can see them, then we anticipate them. And, for me, maybe it's a little bit the way developmental psychology and topologies can sort of depersonalize things, which I think is always helpful when everything doesn't feel so personal. It certainly makes it easier to choose better, I would say.
Yeah.
Well, I want to open it up for questions if anyone's here and they want to chat a question into me and Terri, or if you want to call in, you're welcome to do that. So I believe the buttons on the bottom will let you call in, and you can also just use the chat button if you want to ask a question, which I can then share. So do you see much evidence in politics and business that this sort of teal leadership is beginning to take shape? I mean, like I said, I see it in individuals, but I haven't quite seen them step into big leadership positions yet.
Not in big leadership. I haven't necessarily seen that. I have seen it in individuals who are creating new kinds of collectives, though. And then if you look at Laloux's book, you'll see that there are some organizations there that are really working in this teal turquoise level.
Okay.
That are very, seem to go beyond that process. Holacracy, I think, is another one that plays around in that field. I think we've got some of these structures starting to come up now.
Okay.
And the whole idea is, we have to watch them evolve because, you don't want a structure that doesn't evolve at all. You want to have a capacity for things to be adaptive, very quickly adaptive, without changing so fast and so much that people can't adapt along with it.
Right. I mean, it has to strike the balance of being resistant to change so that it doesn't change on impulse or with a wave of popularity, but then it can't be like changing the Constitution in the United States is so cumbersome that it's unlikely we'll see another constitutional amendment, go pro or con, because it's 2/3 of Congress, 2/3 of the Senate, 2/3 of the states. I mean, in today's world, that's a pretty tall order,
Yes, it is. It is a tall order.
Great. Well, Terri, it doesn't look like we have any questions coming in. So, I mean, it's a fascinating big view to me, and helpful to step back from all this stuff and look at the cycles that hold us. Just like it's fascinating to look at the developmental arcs that hold us and transform the view with which we see the world. It's been helpful and illuminating to look at the cultural things that are happening in the cycles there that we're held in. And I hope you're right. I hope, and I too. I mean, I look at the future and I feel hopeful. I'm sort of programmed, to be an optimist, sort of a default optimist. And some of the really, powerful thinkers out there do not share that with me. But I certainly look at the future, and I am hopeful that we will, as we've always done, get through. And even if a cycle, to your point, takes us in what seems like a backwards or downward direction, I still have faith that in the end that ultimately will serve our growth and our development as a collective.
We may have needed to go backwards in order to heal the errors we made on our first or second try.
Yeah. So, and if you take a long enough view, you don't want to be living through one of those downturns, but as Gandalf said, all we have is the time we are given.
That's right.
Great. Well, Terri, thank you very much for the time and for the wisdom. And if people want to learn more about you, where would they go?
Just to Stages International. They can leave a message if they want to, or check out any of the things that we have there. And I'm always happy to hear from anybody.
Great. Actually, we do have one question here, Terri. I'm going to go ahead and share this on the screen. So Karen is saying, how can I get that to... Okay, so it says, okay, so she's saying, that shows... Oh, she's saying there's on Ray, I need my glasses, I'm sorry. On Ray Kurzweil's website, there's a graph he made that shows that Terry's point about the logarithmic pace of increasing complexity goes all the way back to the Big Bang. So I think that's what. So she's, what would that be? She's saying that it's true in the physical world, ergo it's true in the human realm as we evolve up and through obviously the physical realm ourselves, right?
Yes, the thing that I feel about, it's just that going from the timeless to time to the timeless on the other side of time, that cycle, I'm not sure is represented in some of these. Sometimes we fall off the edge into technology,
Right.
And that's different. And I support good technological processes because I really do think that that it can support the evolution of humanity. But I do think that we don't ask the question about harm enough, and that can take away sometimes more than what we get from it.
Yeah, and that question could arise at healthy amber, healthy orange, right? Healthy green. There's nothing that's preventing the question, and it could even be built into a capitalistic system with the acknowledgement that not asking the question pushes the harm onto the stakeholders, which are all of us, the people that are running the companies as much as the people that are buying the products, and so that might be more of an educational shift than a developmental shift. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, and I agree with your stance on being an optimist. I think we all can be an optimist, and I think optimism is catching. That doesn't mean that we don't do anything, though.
Well, sure, right. I mean, yeah.
Even from a person, even from a more sacred point of view, God is in your feet as well as your head, and your heart. So. And we have a responsibility, every one of us, in my view, we all have a responsibility to do what we can to have an optimistic view and also see that the goodness happens, that people don't get hurt along the way. And if you see somebody, that happening to somebody, to help, in some way.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. Just ask what harm would this do? I mean, it's a relatively simple. I mean, it makes me think when Google was first founded, right? They had their slogan was "Don't be evil," which is kind of a version of that, but that long ago disappeared from Google. and I'll let someone else opine whether Google is net positive or net evil these days. But I certainly think they maybe could be asking the question of, what harm is this doing? Maybe a little, that could be a little bit more,
we can
asked a little more often.
Ask that at every level of development, and we don't too often.
We don't. Beautiful. I think that's a great note to end it on. So thank you again, Terri, for the time and the wisdom. It was great talking with you.
Thank you so much, Keith.
All right.